Hi, Sam from Folk of All Trades here, and welcome to our garden on beautiful Kaurna country. Thanks to Resilient South for supporting this video. That's the cities of Marion, Mitcham, Holdfast Bay and Onkaparinga. We're here today to talk about composting and worm farming. We're going to talk about cold composting, hot composting and also worm farming. Let's talk about cold composting. Now, that's my favourite method. It's the method that we started composting with, and I think it's the best suited to most people in terms of producing a little bit of kitchen scraps all the time, maybe every now and again doing a garden clear out where you got some materials from the garden, and then over time building up amounts of compost that you can spread around your garden. It's a really nice closed loop system that you can have in your own household. So when we're talking about food scraps, just basically anything that's coming out of the kitchen, the general rule is if it once grew, then it can be composted. The typical things that you might be putting in there are fruit and vegetables, scraps, kitchen towel, eggshells, coffee, tea, all those kind of things. We are quite pedantic not to allow plastic in at any point, so that means taking stickers off fruit if they have them, checking the tea bags in case they might have the plastic casings, or using loose leaf tea, an even better option. And so anything coming out of the kitchen can go in, but then also some more unusual things people may not have thought of: pet hair, human hair, toenail clippings, all of that kind of stuff. If it grew, it can go in. The caveat to that is it can be trickier to cold compost some things. Meat is one of them. It tends to be really stinky. I do compost dairy and bread, and the reason most people don't recommend putting that into a cold composting system is because it can attract vermin. So the best way we've found to make sure you don't get mice and rats going into your compost bin is actually to use something like this Avery mesh on the bottom of your compost bin. Now, there are lots of different types of cold composting setups. We favour the bin, and these ones are actually Gedye, G-E-D-Y-E. Some people call them Daleks. They're super commonly available here in South Australia. And some councils even offer discounted or free compost bins, which is really cool. Now, so they're an open bottom system. So they've got this lid, they're all made from recycled plastic, which is nice, and they're UV stabilized, so they last decades. You might even be able to pick them up, on the second-hand market. And basically, the reason I like them so much is because they contain everything. They keep it all together and keep it neat. And as I said, with the Avery mesh on the bottom and then folded up around the sides, it does a really good job of excluding vermin too. And that contact with the soil I find really useful because any extra moisture can go down into the soil. If we have a heat wave or the compost gets really hot, and things like worms don't like to be too hot, they can actually escape down into the soil and get relief and not die. So that's a really nice part of open bottom composting. You can use what's called an open bay method, where you've basically got pallets or timbers or sheets of corrugated iron, and you just throw stuff in there. The reason I don't tend to like that is because there's no real way to exclude vermin. You've got to cover it with hessian or something all the time to stop birds flicking it all around. Yeah, I find it's just much simpler on a home scale to use something like this. Now, kitchen scraps, people are normally pretty good about that. They put, kitchen scraps in, they know what that looks like. There is a little bit of balance in there at the moment. So people talk about carbon and nitrogen ratios, and it can all get a bit confusing in terms of, how do I balance it? I find most people put way too much green stuff in there. So all of the kitchen scraps, leafy greens from the garden waste, all of that kind of stuff, manures, they all contain a lot of nitrogen, and a lot of them are green in color, so people call them greens. What we need to balance with all that nitrogen-rich stuff is carbon-rich. So that's things like paper. This came in a box the other day. We ordered something, and that's a really good addition to your compost. You can also buy just bedding straw from fodder stores. I really like that. It's got a couple of plastic strings, but it essentially doesn't come packaged in plastic, and that's a really good source of carbon too. It's obviously a waste product from growing wheat or barley or lots of those things that we grow here in South Australia. So that's a really good addition. And what I tend to do is add at least as much carbon material as I added nitrogen-rich material by volume. Because people talk about, you know, these different ratios with different numbers. It can all get a bit confusing, and it's like, how much carbon and nitrogen is in a green piece of lettuce? I'm not sure. But basically, you try and balance it out, at least in terms of volume, and then, you know, you can adjust as you go. If things are looking really slimy and really stinky, then you can add a bit more nitrogen. If they're looking really, really dry, add a bit more carbon. If they're looking really dry and, you know, kind of nothing's happening, things are just sitting there and not decomposing, then you can add more nitrogen. And what I tend to do is always add my nitrogen stuff, like my kitchen scrap bucket just goes in. I add my carbon material on top of that. And the reason I do that is because that way I'm always going to be getting that layering, that lasagna method. If I don't, then typically the next time I come out, you know, I'll put in my kitchen scraps again, and I think, oh, I'll do the carbon another time, and, you know, inevitably it layers up, and then it becomes hard to mix and becomes this slimy mat. So by adding it every time, you're always ensuring you get that good layering. Plus, it actually really cuts down on things like vinegar flies. I don't know if anyone else has had that experience where you come out to the compost bin, you lift it up, and poof, you get hit in the face with all these vinegar flies. It's not very pleasant. So by adding your carbon material on top, really cuts down on that. The other ingredient that's really important is adequate moisture. If you've got a lot of wet things in your kitchen scraps, you know, yogurts and, you know, leftover bits of food and all that kind of stuff, then you may not need to add very much water. Depends on the year and the time of year. But I find I just need to add a little sprinkle of water just every now and again. You're looking for the mix to be as wet as a wrung out sponge, which kind of just means, you know, if you really, really squeezed it, maybe you'd get a drop of moisture out of it, but essentially not. It's, you know, it's damp throughout, but it's not wringing wet. That's another reason I like that open bay. Any excess moisture that you put on can escape and it's not sitting in a puddle at the bottom. If you are on pavers or bricks or something like that, then you just need to be mindful not to overwater, basically. Little and often's a good way to go. So what you need to do is just keep layering, layering, layering. As I said, dairy and bread, we find those very easy to home compost. Meat we avoid. Animal poos are okay as long as they come from things like birds or, you know, any ruminant animals, basically vegetarian animals, so your horses, goats, donkeys, sheep, all that kind of stuff, cows, that's all good poo. The poo you want to avoid are things like dog poo and cat poo and human poo, carnivorous poo in a cold composting system, because it just doesn't get hot enough to kill the parasites that might be in it. Weed seeds is another thing. We tend not to put things that we're grabbing out of the garden that are seeding, you know, things like wild barley and chickweed and all this kind of thing. That's better off going into your green council bin or green waste collection, and they can compost that in facilities that get much hotter. The other thing is sometimes people like to use some kind of liner for their compost bin. A lot of the councils give out these. Biobag is one brand, and basically use that as a liner to keep your compost bin really clean. By all means use those. If we use these, we tend to just dump them into the compost bin. We don't put the bag in itself, and the reason for that is because these aren't designed to break down in a home composting system. So after it's been through the whole process, it's probably shredded and come apart a bit, but it will eventually sort of be floating around your garden and just looks a bit unsightly. It's hard to tell whether it is oil-based plastic or it's plant plastic. So we leave those out. We put those in the green bin along with any pet poo and meat and bones and things like that. And instead, what I tend to do is either line the bottom with newspaper, or when I'm out here and I've just emptied my scrap bucket anyway, I just grab a handful of straw and I put that in the bottom. And so that's now a bed that collects any moisture, keeps the bin a little bit cleaner, and it's that little bit of added carbon that's going to help the mix. So layer, 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 keep doing that for as long as it takes to get the bin full. Okay, so we've got our full bin here. Now, I say it's full. You can see there's a little bit of space in there. Yesterday it was chock full. I put quite a bit of green waste in from the garden and I could barely get the lid on. But because composting is always happening, that's sunk back down, and so I could actually fit a little bit more in. But I've made the decision, today is turning day. And so I'm going to be tipping from this bin into my second bin. Now, if you've got a 3-bin system, then you can just leave this. You can rest it and come back in, say, 6 months' time when it's fully broken down. Because I've only got the 2 bins and luckily I've still got a strong enough back that I can physically turn it, I'm going to take that opportunity. The benefit of doing it is that it speeds up the process, but it also gives a bit of an opportunity for me to fix any issues that might have arisen in my layering. Maybe it got too wet, maybe it got too dry. I can basically fix those as I'm turning. So we've got our empty bin over here. If you're starting from scratch, then you might have 2 empty bins to begin with. You've filled the first one, this one's ready to turn into. Or if you've already got a process going, then you can empty the one that's ready, put it out on the garden, and then it's ready to turn into. So I'm going to start using my garden fork to move things over. Now that's looking pretty good in terms of the amount of straw in there, my carbon layer, and then I've got a good layer of nitrogen, my greens, so I'll keep going. Things are maybe looking slightly dry. You never want them to be dusty. If you've got cobwebs or lots of creepy crawlies, that you would typically see on the surface of the soil, like in your garden, growing in there and living in there, spiders, things like that, then typically it's probably going to be too dry. So I'm just going to add a little bit of moisture at this stage. As I said earlier, you want it as wet as a wrung out sponge. And so just adding a little bit of moisture, and I'm about to hit some more of my green layer as well. So I'm just going to add a touch more of my nitrogen just to balance things out a bit. I'll keep going. Things are starting to look much more broken down now. This is probably a few weeks old at least. And you can see there's actually steam coming off of it. So although this is cold composting, it does actually generate a fair bit of heat, probably at least 45, 50 degrees. It's quite cool today. So these layers are looking pretty good. Again, I might add a little bit of moisture, just keep fixing little bits and pieces. I'll keep going with this. We're down pretty close to the bottom now, and things are fairly well broken down. As you can see, a lot of it's falling through the fork, which makes it kind of awkward. And that's when I typically switch to something like this broad-headed shovel, and that just makes it a bit easier to get that last bit. And this is not that far away from being ready to use, so you can see how if you'd left this a bit longer, the whole lot would end up like that. This is the sort of 2-3 months old stuff at the very bottom. But it's actually really good that that's at the top now, because we're bringing up lots of those worms, lots of those microorganisms. They can sit on the top and slowly work their way down through the rest of the less decomposed stuff. So it's also a good idea to switch to the shovel because I'm at less risk of kind of puncturing or trapping that Avery mesh that I put down the bottom. So this is nearly scraped out. I don't have to get absolutely all of it. If you're already composting, it's actually good to leave a little bit of the previous compost in the bottom, kind of like a mother, like with a sourdough or a kombucha SCOBY. All of those microorganisms are ready to go and start composting your next batch. So I'm going to call that empty now. There's a little bit left. Danny might just show you that I've left some, particularly around the sides, but we're down to the Avery mesh down the bottom. All right, our bin is now full. We've emptied the original, and so it's time to cap that off. And to make it really, really obvious that this compost is not to be added to, I really like to put something heavy on, like a brick or a paver, particularly if you're not the only composter in the house, just so it's super clear. This is not to be added to, this is finished, this is resting. It's so frustrating when your compost is just about ready to go and then someone puts a heap of food scraps on top. You gotta pick them out. So I recommend putting that on top and then waiting the 2 to 3 months or until this one's full before you can then use it. Well, how long does the compost take before it's ready? It's one of these questions that it really depends. So a few of the factors that determine how long it might take are the temperature. So in warmer seasons, things are happening a lot faster and breakdown is occurring much more quickly. Whereas in winter, everything slows down and gets a bit more sluggish. It also depends on how active your microbes are, how many worms you've got, what kind of fungi are in the system, so they can all determine how quickly things go too. And the final thing is the particle size. Basically, the smaller the bits, the faster everything can happen. So depending, it'll probably take, between 2 and 4 months. For us, it typically takes 2 to 3 months, depending on the season. And luckily, that's about the same amount of time that it takes to fill our other bin, which is why a 2-bin system works so well for us. If you were finding it was much slower and this was nowhere near ready, then you might need to extend to 3 bins or get bigger bins. Now, one tip that I have, normally, as you saw in the last clip, we keep the lid on with a brick on so no one puts anything else in there. But for actually the last couple of weeks before I intend to harvest it, I take the lid off. And that's really useful because it kind of accelerates the last bit of the curing process and releases any excess moisture. What I tend to do as well is just give it a little bit of a stir with the fork just to break things up and ensure any uncomposted material that's sitting on the top gets a chance to be mixed through. Now it is time to harvest this one. It's ready to go. It's absolutely looking beautiful. Not quite like you'd see in the landscape yards or if you buy compost as a bagged product. That's all really finely sieved and they're doing it at really high temperatures as well. But this stuff is just so full of goodness and nutrient. It may be slightly underdone, it could potentially go longer, particularly if you've got some chunky material in there. And so for that reason, I always recommend spreading compost on top of the soil with home compost and even with bought compost too. And the benefit of that is all of the microorganisms that are living inside the soil, they can come up and they can bring down the bits that they need. The fungi can work on it and basically it gets taken in a natural way into the soil. If you mix the soil profile and really try and incorporate that compost, unfortunately what can happen is if there's any bits of carbon that are still breaking down, then actually nitrogen will get robbed from the soil and it may affect your plant growth. So by spreading it on the top, you avoid that problem altogether. The soil remains undisturbed, all the microorganisms are exactly where they want to be, and it just slowly gets incorporated over time. The other benefit is that it actually provides kind of a bit of a mulch and can keep in moisture and protect the soil surface as well. So that's how we use compost. We spread it around on top of the soil, around our fruit trees, around our berries, and around our veggies, whatever needs a good bit of nutrition at the time. Okay, we're going to talk about hot composting now. So cold composting, as I mentioned, little bits, layering that carbon and nitrogen. With hot composting, you're still doing all that layering and you want to get your carbon and nitrogen balance right, but you're adding everything at the same time. So it tends to be kind of a good morning's activity or an afternoon. Takes a good couple of hours. And so I won't show it to you, the process now. We're still actually emptying our hot compost bay from a year ago. So hot composting typically can produce compost faster than a cold compost system, but that requires a fair bit of turning. So we're kind of lazy with it and we're happy just to leave it, to rest it for a year. And then at the end of this season, then we can fill it and start the process again. So how do you do it? Well, basically we need to gather all of our materials. So because we need such a big volume, we typically wait until there's lots of things to pull out of the garden, lots of leaves and stalks. We're just coming into spring now, so lots of the things that have been growing over winter, all the brassica leaves and parsnip and beetroot, all those kind of things, they're going to go in. In order to balance it out, I find adding quite a lot of manure really helpful. This is horse manure. It's readily available down here, south of Adelaide. I know it's even available in the suburbs if you've got a race course or what have you near you. And I really like it because it typically has the manure itself, which is quite fibrous. Horses aren't particularly efficient at digesting, so there's lots of good carbon-rich material in their poo as well as the nitrogen. But typically what they're doing is they're scraping out their sleeping areas, and so you're almost always getting free bedding in there as well. In this case there's sawdust, otherwise there might be bedding straw. So that's a really good thing to add. Adds a huge amount of bulk as well as microorganisms that already exist on the manure. That's typically a time that we empty out our chicken coop as well when we're about to do a hot compost. And chicken poo is amazing. It's really high nitrogen. There's no way you'd ever use it fresh on the garden, but it really kicks things along in a in a hot compost system. So we gather it all up and throw it in there. Now, what we still want to do is make sure we're layering. So putting down a good layer of carbon material. Typically we use at least a bale of bedding straw, sometimes two, making sure that we're getting good layering, you know, at least sort of 5, 10, 15 centimeters thick each layer, and watering them in. So I might start off with my bedding straw, then I'll put a heap of greens, then I'll put my manure on top, and then start the process again, layering, 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 and making sure that I water each layer so that, you know, everything's as wet as it needs to be, as wet as a wrung out sponge again. And basically it's gonna be a huge volume. That's why we've got these pallet type timbers that can stack on top of each other. You know, it might start off this tall and then it will rapidly shrink down, 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 and that way we can keep moving it around. Basically, there's not a huge amount you need to do to it once it's built. You can turn it, and as I said, that'll increase the speed. It is a good time to, good idea to give it a bit of a water just so it doesn't dry out, particularly over summer. You know, it can be losing a lot of moisture. We usually cover ours when we're not harvesting them in things like hessian, cardboard. That also gives the opportunity for things like worms. If they're looking for carbon sources, they can actually eat that hessian and that cardboard and balance things out. But that's hot composting. As I said, if you don't have a big garden, you know, it can be a more difficult thing or a more advanced thing. We cold composted for years before we started hot composting, but it's really good fun and it produces a lot of really good compost. And I want to talk about worm farms. This is a worm farm that we haven't been using for a little while. It's a 2-tier worm farm and easily obtainable from the hardware store. Again, some councils give it away or subsidise the cost. And worm farming is really good if you don't have the space for composting. You can only compost a much smaller amount of materials, which kind of makes sense. So the rest will still need to go in your green bin. But yeah, a fantastic thing because it produces something that compost doesn't, which is worm castings, just this incredible material that can go around plants and go into potting soils, and also worm juice, or as kids like to call it, worm wee. So yeah, worm farming is a really, really cool thing to do. This is, as I said, a 2-tier system, and if you were just starting off with worm farming, you would just go with 1 tier, and basically what you're doing is you're putting the bedding material that comes with the worms down to the bottom, you're putting the worms in there, and then you're going to add food scraps to the top. And the reason you do that is because the worms will come up as they're hungry and they'll eat the scraps that you leave and they'll take them down into their castings. It's really important not to overfeed them, particularly, you know, when you've only got a small number to begin with. As they build up over time, they can eat heaps and heaps of food. But, you know, if you start to notice that food is going moldy or, you know, they're just not getting through it, then it's maybe time to put those food scraps into the green bin or into another composting system. Little and often is the best thing for worms. And as you build up, you'll notice they increase in number and the more castings happen. Then what you can do is actually add your other tier. And so that goes onto the top. Continue to add food scraps and they'll work their way up and continue to eat. Now, a few things you need to know about worms. They have very small mouths. So, you know, they can't eat really big chunks of food, particularly if you're doing things like smoothies or you've already broken up the material in some way. They find that really, really easy to eat and super quick. And the other thing is they don't like a couple of foods. So onion skins is one that is really not their jam, and also citrus they don't particularly enjoy. If you put those things into a compost bin, it's absolutely fine because other stuff breaks it down enough that then the worms can help and finish the job and consume it. But in a worm farm, it's best to avoid putting in those onion skins and citrus, and you want to leave out things like, you know, bread and dairy and meat, because that definitely does attract vermin and it's much harder to keep them out. It is important to keep them moist, and one of the ways that you do that is by putting some kind of covering on top of the food scraps. Hessian is a really nice choice. If you know a coffee roaster, you might be able to ask for some Hessian. Otherwise, newspaper, old 100% cotton fabric is a really, really good thing to use. So, you know, if you've got a gardening shirt that's just far beyond, you know, make sure you take away any polyester stitching, and then you can lay that on top and the worms will happily eat that, as well as it protecting them and keeping them moist, because they do like to be moist and they do like to be kept dark. So always keep the lid on. That protects them from things like blackbirds and things as well. Now, you can use a system like this. The biggest downfall I see of these is because they're such a small volume, they can overheat. And when I used to work with schools, I would find that quite often the schools and the kindergartens would lose their worms over summer. They just couldn't keep them cool enough. And so what I'd recommend is over summer, they actually put the whole lot into a compost bin, and that way the worms can go down into the soil. Then when the summer's finished, they can harvest the worms back out and continue to use it. The other thing you can do is actually knock the legs off and put this onto the ground. You know, sorry, put the trays onto the ground so that the worms can escape into the soil. And that way you don't get the worm juice, but at least the worms can go down into the ground. You might just want to do that during heat waves. I know some people even move their worms inside into the laundry, you know, in those real hot times, just to keep them going. What we've decided is this is probably too small for our style of worm farming, and so we've actually incorporated a worm farm into our greenhouse design. And the reason for that is there's constantly water dripping down from the plants as they get irrigated, and we just find we don't have to think about it. They're always being watered. You can hear trickling happening, so I tipped a little bit of water in, and there's actually a bucket down there that collects worm juice. That's really, really cool because we can collect that worm juice and it makes the most amazing tonic for watering seedlings and keeping them healthy. The other thing is sometimes, you know, nutrients will wash out of your seedlings as they're growing, fertilizer that's been in the potting media, and so you're actually retaining all of those nutrients as well and can feed them back to them. So you can build it out of anything you like. The bigger the volume, the better. I've seen people use those big IBCs. We've just built this one out of timber and lined it with a pond liner. Yeah, lots of really cool designs online, bathtubs, all kinds of things, old fridges. So that's worm farming. If you've got any questions, please let us know down in the comments and we'll try to get back to you. And a big thanks to Resilient South for supporting this video.